Today we're diving into a really tough question, drawn from the work of the philosopher D.L. Dantes. What happens when our desire for justice, well, when it starts to look like an appetite for something else?
And this quote right here, it really sets the stage for everything we're about to explore. Justice that needs a body count to feel complete is not justice. It is appetite wearing a robe. Wow, that's a powerful statement, and it forces us to ask a really important question right off the bat.
Okay, so if it's an appetite, where does that even come from? I mean, how does a person or even an entire community get to a place where justice stops being a principle and starts feeling more like a hunger that has to be fed? Well, according to this, it all starts with this tiny, almost invisible shift in how we think. We go from simply identifying that a harm was done to actively craving punishment for the person who did it. And this shift, it often shows up looking like moral clarity, but it's actually driven by something much, much deeper. All right, let's get into it. Section 1, justice or appetite. We're going to break down how a stable principle can actually morph into this all-consuming emotion. And at the absolute heart of this shift is a feeling that, let's be honest, is almost impossible for us to bear as human beings: powerlessness. It's defined here as the ache of knowing that a loss cannot be undone. When you're faced with a loss that you can never, ever fix, that ache is so deep, we'll do almost anything to make it stop. And this is where we see two totally different paths emerge. On one side, you've got principled justice. It's meant to be an objective standard, something that aims to protect. But when that feeling of powerlessness takes over, it can warp into this other thing, this emotional justice, which really is just a story we tell ourselves to make violence feel clean, to make it feel justified. The goal isn't protection anymore. It's just about satisfying a feeling inside. This whole idea gets even deeper when we start looking at the actual words we use. Which brings us to our next section, what we mean by justice. Because, as you're about to see, the language here, it really, really matters. Okay, let's talk about the word closure. We hear it all the time, right? Especially in legal cases. But the source here makes a critical point. Closure is a psychological state. It's something that happens inside of you. It is not, and it can never be, a product that a court sentence can just hand over. And this really gets to the heart of what a court sentence can, and maybe more importantly, cannot do. Look, a sentence can do incredibly important things. It can restrain a dangerous person, for sure. It can signal accountability. It can establish consequences. But we have to be brutally honest about what it can't do. It cannot turn back the clock. It can't bring someone back to life. And it cannot restore innocence that's been stolen. So this just sharpens the focus on the two roads a justice system can take. Is the goal protection and accountability, something driven by logic that's proportional and consistent? Or does it become about emotional gratification, a spectacle designed for satisfaction? The argument here is that when punishment is used like a tranquilizer for our pain, the need for it just keeps growing. It becomes unstable and it always, always escalates. Okay, now we're getting to what is really the intellectual and emotional core of this entire argument. It's a thought experiment, and it's called the proxy punishment test. The source poses this absolutely devastating question, and I want you to really sit with it for a second. If a person kills your child, does justice mean you must kill their child? Just think about that. Now, that feeling you probably have right now, that immediate pushback, that sense of, no, that's wrong, that feeling of recoil, the author argues that's not just an emotion. That's a moral signal. That's a piece of ethical data, and it's worth paying attention to. So why does it feel so deeply wrong? Well, the logic here is super specific. For one, it transfers guilt to an innocent person. That makes guilt contagious. It's the kind of logic you see in a blood feud, not a system of justice. It doesn't actually restore any kind of balance, it just repeats the original crime under a new name. But this brings up a really disturbing question, doesn't it? If our own moral compass tells us this is wrong, then how on earth does cruelty become, well, normal in a society? This next section explores that very process. It all starts when we get two very different things mixed up: accountability and emotional reward. See, accountability is a healthy boundary. It's a society saying, this behavior cannot exist here. But emotional reward, that's a craving. That's saying, I want you to suffer. And a system gets corrupted the moment it starts trying to satisfy that craving. And this doesn't just happen by accident. According to the source, it's a deliberate 3-step process. First, you rebrand the language. Killing becomes justice. Revenge becomes closure. Second, you redefine the person. They're no longer a human who did something awful, they're a monster, someone who exists outside of our moral community. And finally, you reframe the act itself, so that cruelty actually starts to look like a moral good, like a virtue. And here's the really dangerous result of all this. The whole conversation changes. We stop talking about universal principles, and we start talking about categories. The question is no longer, what is just? It becomes, who is human enough to deserve our restraint? And once you go there, justice isn't universal anymore. It's selective. So if that's the path that leads to cruelty, is there another way? Our final section looks at a totally different vision for justice, one that's built on a completely different foundation. Because once a society heads down that road, something pretty chilling happens. The difference between murder and justice becomes a matter of branding rather than ethics. It just perfectly captures that paradox, right? A culture that says it hates cruelty, but depends on it, as long as it's wrapped up and sold as righteousness. The alternative being offered here is prevention. And look, this isn't framed as some kind of soft approach, not at all. The source argues that prevention is the most serious form of public safety there is, because it's the only thing that actually interrupts the pipeline of trauma and rage that creates harm to begin with. And this really brings the whole argument right down to a deeply personal, ethical gut check. If I can justify killing because I'm furious, then the only difference between me and the offender is the story I tell myself. The implication here is pretty clear. Our personal story, it's just not a strong enough foundation to build real justice on. And that leaves us right here with this final, really provocative question. If our systems of justice are just a reflection of the stories we tell ourselves about what's right, then what story do we want to tell?